Good afternoon from The Hague, Europol headquarters here. Good morning to some other parts in the world, in the US, I understand, and have a good day for wherever you are. My name is Jan Ellermann. I'm a senior specialist in Europol's data protection function, and I have the honor to welcome you here as your host and moderator for the fourth Eden Community event titled Cross-Border Investigation and Prosecution of AI-Driven Crime. Maybe before I introduce the panelists to you, just a few words about the Eden Network. So as some of you may already know, Eden is not just a garden, but Eden also stands for Europol Data Protection Experts Network. And we founded this network some 10 years ago in order to foster a dialogue between any stakeholders who are interested in topics drawing links between data protection, law enforcement, but also cybersecurity in the widest possible sense. And then obviously cross-border investigation and prosecution of AI-driven crime falls right within the remit of what we love to discuss here. Eden community events are not organized by Europol as such, but here special thanks to Dr. Ilya Kolochenko, who put a lot of effort into pulling up this fantastic webinar here for you. With that, I would like to welcome our speakers today. So I'm just going to introduce them very briefly to you so that they can still introduce themselves in more detail. But we have Philippe Langlois. He's data breach investigation specialist, and he's the author of a report which Verizon puts out about data breach investigations. I'm also very happy to welcome Orhan Osmani, the head of the Cybersecurity Division at BDT and International Telecommunication Union, ITU, representative. Next to him, Victoria Baines, who's a former colleague of mine, basically. So used to work at Europol many years ago, but then also worked for Facebook. She's a professor emerita of information technology at Gresham College. First and foremost, a very bright mind. I'm happy to see you here, Vic. Next to her then Catherine Barrett, so JD MBA. She's with the American Bar Association and also at Annapolis Analytics. And last but not least, Brian J. Bennison. He's Assistant Dean for Graduate Studies at GMU Antonin Scalia Law School. So with these different perspectives, I don't want to waste much time, but would hand over to Philippe to kick off the conversation. Each of you, we pre-agreed, has some 8 to maximum 10 minutes to make some points which you deem most relevant. And afterwards, we still have a bit of time to enter into a moderated talk, then hopefully also picking up some of the questions from the audience. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Philippe.
thank you. Yep, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to try to do a presentation share here. I only have a very small number of slides, but basically what we wanted to do was really kind of start off with communicating what is the current cybersecurity landscape, and specifically, what are the implications to some of these AI developments? So as we talk, we're all bringing in our different perspectives, which is, I think, what makes this panel really amazing. I'm coming in as one of the authors of the data breach investigation report. So this is a yearly report that's released by Verizon that looks at this current cybersecurity landscape. We've been doing this for 19 years, which gives us a relatively unique perspective in terms of some of the major trends. And our data is based on 31,000 incidents and 22,000 breaches, which cut across a wide span of different countries. So what really makes this report powerful is not just that we're doing it, we've been doing it for a while, but it's really because we're able to do this due to the community of folks that help contribute data to help this report. So that's a little bit of the facts and why we're able to talk about cybersecurity. But there's 3 major things I really want to communicate. I think they'll provide some perspective. Don't worry too much about the numbers and the complexity of the charts. We have a whole report that explains these in detail. But really what I want to talk about at first is looking in terms of the rise of exploitation of vulnerability. So cyber criminals and nation states have been leveraging, what we kind of call the core 3 ways to compromise organizations. We see credential abuse as historically being one of the main ways, but we've seen the shift in the last couple of years where we're seeing this rise in the exploitation of vulnerabilities as being one of the main ways in which organizations are being compromised. Right? Historically, we would kind of see that largely within the nation state perspective, right? Where they had the resources to develop these types of vulnerabilities and these types of exploits. And there's really been kind of a shift where now a lot of cyber criminals are also leveraging these exact same techniques to compromise organizations. But to kind of put a little different spin on it, right, there's the second half of this equation, which is how are we as an industry or as a community doing to remediate these vulnerabilities? And the image isn't particularly pretty. We're actually doing worse this year than we have in previous years. So one of the ways we've been measuring or organizations' capabilities of remediating these vulnerabilities is looking at their patch rate for these critical vulnerabilities, which are called the CISA KEVs, which is a known exploited vulnerability. So these are the vulnerabilities that are being documented as being exploited by criminals or nation state sponsored criminals. And what we're seeing is there's actually a drop this year in terms of the percentage of these vulnerabilities being fully remediated. So last year, we were about 38% of these were being fully remediated. Now we're seeing only 26% of organizations are able to fully remediate these vulnerabilities. So from an attack surface, this gives attackers a large amount of targets, right, to go after. In addition, kind of put in perspective, we're not doing as good of a job patching. It's also taking us longer to patch these vulnerabilities. Right. So the median amount of time it takes for organizations to fully remediate is up now 43 days, which is 2 weeks longer than what we saw last year. And part of that, and this is kind of a bit of a complicated chart, but really this is a survival curve, right? So the steeper the curve, the better off. That means we're able to remediate more quicker. And essentially what's happening is that you can see the blue line, which is 2022. By day 30, about 44% of vulnerabilities of these critical vulnerabilities were still open. But 2023, there was improvement, right? Now we're at 35% are still open. 2024, even more improvement, now only 27%. However, now we look at 2025 and then we see a drop, right? We're back to the numbers we were seeing in 2023. And the secret as to why this is actually in the label of this figure. So what we saw last year was a pretty dramatic rise in terms of the number of vulnerabilities that are available and being assessed. So from, we have similar numbers as 2023, but we have 5 times as many vulnerabilities to remediate as we did in 2023. So our metrics are poor, right? We're not able to as quickly remediate or quickly address these vulnerabilities. And then I'm sure the question you guys have is, well, how does this tie back to AI? And I think that's a really reasonable question. One of the things that we were able to do in this year's report is collaborate with one of the frontier labs and look at the abuse cases in terms of for cybersecurity explicitly, right? So we're looking in terms of how actors are leveraging these LLMs to conduct their attacks. I mean, we had access in terms of the types of techniques or capabilities they were researching as part of their abuse of these systems. And we tied it back to our ways in, right? So in terms of the what we saw from our overall incident data to how attackers are leveraging these AI platforms. And this is the breakdown we saw, right? We see phishing as being kind of the most common use case, which makes sense, right? Large language model, translating different languages, your phishing email is kind of a relatively simple and obvious use case. But the second most common thing was developing exploit capabilities, right? Anyone who's used a large language model for some level of vulnerability research is probably familiar in terms of the capabilities of some of these LLMs in terms of being able to create, proof of concept codes or be able to help kind of that process. But we see it as the second most common type of abuse case for these initial access. So we have the stark contrast, right? We have more vulnerabilities we have to deal with, and attackers are increasing their capabilities using large language models to exploit those vulnerabilities. And the last thing we kind of want to talk about is the types of capabilities, right? A little bit more detail in terms of the number and the implications of the capabilities attackers are able to kind of increase using these large language models. So when we looked across the data set, we had about 800 different known attackers that were cataloged within these abuse cases. The median number of different capabilities that these attackers were researching was about 15, right? So for folks who may not be aware, MITRE ATT&CK is this framework that helps categorize what attackers can do from a technical level. And there's hundreds of different techniques. But when we actually look at the abuse cases, it really narrows down to a small subset of techniques that these researchers are increasing their capabilities around, which can be a positive thing for defenders, right? Because when we start looking at, well, what are the use cases or what are the capabilities these attackers are leveraging? Most of these techniques are already well understood by the cybersecurity community, right? That's the figure 7, where we're looking in terms of how many known software is already implementing the technique they're leveraging. So the median number of known software using the techniques that they're researching is 55. So they're not necessarily creating novel attacks. They're not necessarily creating things that we've never seen in the community. They're mass producing these capabilities that have already been seen, and we as defenders are already aware of in terms of how to defend. So, it makes, of course, I think some organizations, especially threat intelligence, a little more complicated as we used to be able to attribute tool sets and technique processes to attackers. Now with these LLMs, a lot of attackers are able to either produce unique malware that have existing capabilities we're aware of, or translate existing frameworks into different languages. So we see kind of this convergence of these large issues, right? The vulnerabilities, the number of vulnerabilities increasing, our inability to be able to quickly remediate these, and then also attackers' ability to increase their own capabilities using LLMs and different generative AI platforms. And this is just a small note in terms of the scale, right? The implications for cybersecurity specific to this isn't really super abundant, but really to kind of talk about how much AI has kind of blossomed, right, over the last couple of years. So one of the things we looked at was just AI bot overall traffic. And what we found is that the month over month has increased pretty dramatic. I think the average month over month increase is 21%, which for comparison, human natural internet increase month over month is 0.3%. So there's been kind of this explosion of AI bots and AI capabilities, and they're not impacting industries equally. So with that, I think I'm going to relinquish my sharing privileges and pass it over to some of my other panelists to provide their perspectives.
Super, Philippe. Thank you. This was really insightful. So, not surprisingly, after 19 years of reporting, you are in the game, of course. And I took good note of the rise in exploitation of vulnerabilities, nation states you mentioned, but also a shift to cyber criminals. That is indeed something which we also observe at Europol. So if you browse to our website and look for the IOCTA, for instance, or also the SOCTA, which are serious and organized crime threat assessment, or the online version, focused version of it, you indeed find this also in our reporting. What I found interesting is that, well, we are doing worse than years compared to previous years, because it's taking longer to patch, you said, also dramatic rise in number of vulnerabilities. And then how does AI play a role? I think this LLM moment we all had, also cyber criminals had that. And phishing has become so much more effective, because in the old days, when you could still say, I get this weird email, it usually didn't take you long to figure out, let's say, that there's something wrong about it. Nowadays, they can look perfect. Huh? So it's become so much more difficult, and confirmed by your finding that the use of AI bots, let's say, is skyrocketing, right? So thank you once again, Philippe, for that overview. With that, I would probably like to pass the floor to Orhan Osmani. So the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, has no mandate on cybercrime and investigation, but I think Orhan can provide a broader perspective, including on setting up certs and how cyber drills are organized to counter the situation, which has just been described by Philippe. So Orhan, floor is yours if you're ready to shoot. I see your slides already.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join this discussion. Let me start by briefly explaining the perspective I bring from the development sector of ITU. You may know ITU as for telecommunication, for satellite filing, for spectrum connectivity or technical standards. But ITU is also an important has an important role in digital development, including cybersecurity capacity building. In fact, many of the people use ITU standards every day without realizing it. For example, how many of you are aware of or how many of you use X509 certificates? And have you ever wondered why it is called X509? So it is called, maybe I explained, it is called X509 because it comes from the ITU-T X series of recommendations. It is an example on how ITU standards support trust, authentication, and security in the digital environment. So in cybersecurity, ITU works across different areas. I think the slide is here just demonstrating that we do work through mandates, so we cannot. That's why, and I think Jan said very clearly that we don't have a mandate on cybercrime, but we have a strong mandate on capacity building. Let me just move to the next slide. So these are the several areas we work across, and we support countries on different pillars, on national cybersecurity strategies, on establishing national certs. We organize cyber drills and cyber exercises. We support capacity building for institutions and experts. We work on child online protection. We measure commitment of progress to cybersecurity through the Global Cybersecurity Index. And through ITU-T, we support international standards related to cybersecurity, trusted identity, and resilience of digital networks. So, and also, I mean, why we don't do anything related to cybercrime? Because we don't have a mandate, as I explained. Though we do not investigate criminal cases, we do not attribute to incidents, and we do not classify threat actors. But we know these responsibilities are with the national authorities, law enforcement agencies, judicial, and so on. But our role of ITU is very complementary. We help countries to build capacity which they require to prevent, detect, respond to, and recover from cyber threats. This distinction is important because cybercrime enforcement and cybersecurity capacity building are different, but they are closely connected. And that's why often we run cyber drills with law enforcement agencies in the countries to build a network and a capacity with different stakeholders. A country, what we have realized that the country may have a strong cybercrime legislation, but if institutions lack resources such as technical expertise, trained law enforcement, informed prosecutors and judges, trusted cooperation channels, the enforcement will remain difficult. In simple terms, a law on the paper is not the same as implementation in practice. And that's why through the work of ITU and the Global Cybersecurity Index, we see many countries are making progress and they are improving on different areas. Maybe I'll just move to the slides. Sorry, I wanted to move to one of the slides, but actually I cannot see it. But anyway, I'm going to share these slides in the chat so you can see the improvements we have seen over the years in terms of commitment. But commitment is not maturity, which means it takes time to mature in whatever commitments you do on the policy and strategy. So implementation is key. But also this progress is not equal everywhere. So different countries have strategies or legislations in place, but they still face challenges in applying them and turning them into real operational capacity. This is why capacity development is important, and ITU and the partners as well, we work together and to help countries to move their commitment to capability. So we support realistic national cybersecurity strategies, strengthen institutions, and we organize often global cyber drills where we bring different stakeholders internationally on the same table where they share information and the network. And the kind of challenges, basically, what countries are facing, what we see is that AI is accelerating both defense and offense in developing countries. Geopolitics is reshaping trust and cooperation and risk. And cybersecurity becomes inequity and is leaving many countries behind. So we see a lot of countries, because of the current changes, they find it very difficult to move forward, because if you are financially capable to have the means to implement the AI, but some countries, even before they try to do anything, they don't have the resources they need, they don't have the people they need, and it becomes really a challenge for them to move forward. And that's why ITU's role is that to build capacity, to ensure the information is shared on the national level and, of course, on international level. I will wrap it up here. So, if you have any questions, we can have conversations. Please let me know. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Orhan, for this, let's say, perspective from the side of an international organization. So I liked very much your opening statement that many of us are using ITU's cybersecurity standards without even knowing it. So this is maybe arguably how it should be, because then security standards shouldn't be burdensome, I would say. So once again, you've put emphasis on the fact that you don't really investigate crime or attribute incidents, but that the role of your organization is truly complementary. And then I understand there's a lot of focus on these cyber drills, which sometimes even can be global cyber drills. But the goal is always to prevent, detect, respond to cybercrime. And I think this is really also where this webinar becomes very interesting, because we've had Verizon as a private party. We're going to hear law enforcement perspective, maybe also from Vic then, based on her previous experience. But like in data protection, so I'm working in data protection, you put emphasis on the fact that it's also about resources, right? Because you can have the best intentions and maybe even the best laws, but if you lack the resources to implement them, it's like you just said, it's nice letters on paper. And even commitment sometimes doesn't help because you need to develop towards maturity. So thank you very much for your efforts to strengthen institutions. With these words, I would like to hand over to Vic Baines. Once again, Vic has been a colleague here at Europol many, many years ago, I shall say. Before that, she was with the UK National Crime Agency. She worked for Facebook. She's a professor. So Vic has been all over the place. Vic, tell us more about your perspective, please.
Thanks, Jan. And I was thrilled because you mentioned very briefly the IOCTA, so Europol's threat assessment on cybercrime. And I get a little flutter every time somebody mentions that, because that's my baby. I started that. And the reason I mention that is not just pure immodesty, but also the fact that I'm drawing on that experience of the last 15 or 20 years, really, to a little bit like Philippe, consider some of the mega trends that we've had in the last 15 or 20 years and how they've challenged law enforcement and criminal justice responses, but also how they've changed them. And because I've only got just a few minutes, it is, I'm afraid, going to be a hugely simplistic appreciation of those issues, but I'm very, very happy to chat some more about those. So let's go back in time, 10, 15, 20 years, and think about traditional assessments of cybercrime back when I was working at Europol, and before that, as Jan mentions, in UK law enforcement. We tended to represent cybercrime like this, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we tended to make some very clear distinctions between profit-driven cybercrime on the one hand and on the other, cyber attacks with other motivations, be they political, ideological, or just, of course, plain mischief. We tended also to make clear distinctions between cyber-dependent crime and cyber-enabled crime. And we did this because we needed to, because cybercrime units in law enforcement and also in the intelligence services couldn't investigate all the serious and organized crime offences simply because they were facilitated by the use of digital technology. And we portrayed the quote unquote true cyber criminals as all powerful magicians with global reach. And this isn't an AI generated image from recent years. This is actually a stock image that graced the National Cybercrime Prevention website for an agency that I am not going to name, but it's a very, very large federal agency in the US. And this only stopped being the dominant image on that website during COVID. And I'm so obsessed with how we communicate about cybercrime and cybersecurity to policymakers, but also to ordinary people about how they can protect themselves and their organizations, that I actually wrote an entire chapter of a book on this image to deconstruct how unhelpful it is to scare the hell out of people. That's not to diminish the threat, and that's not to diminish the seriousness of what we are about today, but I think it does speak to how we used to conceive of and present this 10 to 15 years ago, that this was something that was overwhelming to us. Now, that's a fair point, though, because a number of things happened. And the first was that the sheer number of cybercrimes and cyber attacks challenged law enforcement and intelligence services to such an extent that traditional models of attribution and then of prosecution of individuals were just insufficient. And even when attribution was possible, what authorities quickly found was that where there was state sponsorship or state affiliation of some of the most dangerous actors, this precluded their apprehension and their prosecution. So what happened was that we had these national and international most wanted lists, and they simply grew longer. We also saw that technological developments resulted in a considerable lowering of the entry barrier to becoming a cybercriminal. In recent years, of course, we've seen the repurposing of AI models for criminality, like Worm GPT here, but this is simply the latest of those developments. It's certainly not the first time that we've highlighted an increase in the availability of entry-level tools for cybercrime. And in fact, Jan, in the very first IOCTA, I think I used precisely that sentence back in 2010. And we also found that our neat distinctions between types of crime started to blur pretty rapidly. We saw teenagers in the wider Europe being paid to conduct disinformation campaigns in the interests of hostile states. We saw some nation states starting to derive sizable proportions of their GDP from cybercrime. And the lines between those crime types became harder to draw, as this recent case on the screen demonstrates. Because when a bad actor uses AI to produce child sexual abuse material of real children, ostensibly to extol money from schools, is this a sexual offence? Is it blackmail? Or is it cybercrime? And this isn't just a theoretical question, because it matters on a practical level. Traditionally, those three offences would be investigated by different functions with different specialisms. And equally, we can get a new task force spun up for some of these cross-functional investigations, but we can't keep doing it every time. It's just not sustainable. And so increasingly, what we've started to look at is targeting the cybercriminal infrastructure, as in this very, very recently announced Operation Saffron from last week. Again, this is by no means an entirely new thing. Law enforcement have been taking down botnets for close to 20 years. And it absolutely relies on effective international cooperation and especially information sharing, also multi-stakeholder cooperation and information sharing, and, in particular, partnership with private industry. But I think what's important about this is that it has dual effects because we have immediate disruption of the criminal business model, however temporarily. And we still have the ability of participating countries to investigate subjects making use of these services. For instance, to cross-check the metadata from this investigation with ongoing investigations into persons of interest and to generate new investigative leads. So we used to say that fighting cybercrime and providing a criminal justice response to cyber attacks was about staying one step ahead of the criminals. To some extent, that still holds true in that cyber defense and preventative efforts remain incredibly important, and I expect they always will do. We've also spent many years arguing that regulation needs to keep pace with offending, while recognising at the same time that legislative change can take quite a long time. So it seems to me that by targeting the infrastructure and the enablers, we don't have to keep running this race and often losing this race over and over again. We can, dare I say, we can play and possibly even win a completely different game. But with that, Jan, I'm going to hand back to you and say thank you very much, everyone, for your time.
Super, Vic. Thank you so much. First of all, let me also encourage the audience. So all of you in this webinar have the possibility to use the Q&A box to send questions to the speakers. We have to route the information a little bit, so bear with us. But if you have questions already throughout the presentations, route them directly and I will see if I can pick them up. Thank you, Vic, basically for your insightful presentation here, focusing on what you call the mega trends and how they have challenged law enforcement and how we had to adapt and change. Also, yeah, it's a funny thing. I wasn't aware anymore that the first eye octa used to had your fingers in there. So even better, that's great. So it's a while, isn't it? But indeed, very important that, as you said, in the good old days, we had this distinction, which was clear. Is it profit-driven cybercrime or is it state actor-sponsored cyber attacks? In the meantime, all of that is becoming so much more blurry. And then I also like your point to say, well, how do we go about this? How do we all communicate about it? And is it really helpful to scare the hell out of people? Maybe not, huh? Or maybe not always. Could potentially be part of a prevention scheme, but just scaring people probably also doesn't do the trick. Anyway, we will get back to that, I'm sure. With that, for the moment, I would like to welcome Catherine Barrett. So Catherine also has a cybercrime background. She's working for a nonprofit in the US for the last couple of years. And Catherine is very passionate about the importance of data governance, including privacy and data protection, as well as info security. And as this is the Europol Data Protection Experts Network, I've already said to Catherine, I'm very, very happy about her intervention because we have the link to privacy data protection things then very prominently. Catherine, floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. I'm just trying to pull up my slides. Just a second. Okay.
Something is happening. Yeah, indeed. That
Good.
looks fantastic. Yes, we can see them. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me today. I am very passionate about data governance and data management. I spent 10 years working in cybersecurity with the MITRE Corporation, which I think was mentioned earlier. And specifically working alongside of cyber warfare officers and cyber security professionals for intelligence organizations and our defense organizations. So I wanted to really focus on I took a look at the EU Serious Organized Crime Threat Assessment, and I was curious to find what are the top line security threats that the organization has identified. And they're almost all exclusively online or aided significantly by online activities. None of this will be news to the audience, but we can see that these crimes, that some of which only took place in the brick and mortar world that we used to all live in, such as drug trafficking, now has a significant component of online. So the online world has become this enabling tool that criminal organizations have exploited, and they've used this online platform, as we know, for disguising identity, for scaling up their activities quickly, for encrypted communications so that they are disguised from law enforcement, and really to recruit new talent to their organizations. And now we see, with the advent of AI being so readily available, AI augmented cyber attacks, for example, and financial crimes are on the rise. So, as leaders noted in the latest Europol podcast called "The Future of Europol," Europol really requires additional resources, the leaders noted, to ensure trusted and reliable, accessible data that needs to be available to respond to these growing threats. I'm a dog lover, and I was trying to figure out a way to incorporate canines into this, and I thought that's not too hard because we're talking about law enforcement. And of course, we can see here that, a canine is trained to assist and to be an extension of the law enforcement capabilities, right? They're there to provide threat detection, physical protection, and evidence recovery. These canines need to be carefully vetted. They have to be trained, and they have to be carefully managed throughout their lifetime to be truly trusted assistant to the law enforcement community. Likewise, data has to be carefully selected. It has to be carefully trained, carefully managed to be a trusted resource for inputs to these digital tools that we are coming to rely more and more on to fight crime. Also to share intelligence with our counterparts, and to have a reliable operational environment to prosecute and to go after criminal activity. So how do we do this? We focus on data governance. Data governance really is the key that provides a formal approach to managing the quality and the security and the availability of an organization's data. That's all data governance is. It's taking a formal approach, a rigorous approach, a systematic approach to the management of data, and harnessing that data in a way that will create the trusted environment needed to prosecute these crimes and to go after law enforcement, or to go after criminal activity online, and to be a trusted partner with the law enforcement community. Data governance includes defining and implementing data governance policies, standards, and procedures for data collection and ownership and storage and processing and use. Now, I've actually had the pleasure, while I was working at the MITRE Corporation and working with a colleague of mine who's a leader in the American Bar Association named Michael Eisenberg, the two of us together had the pleasure of working with the chief chief data officer of the U.S. military service. So he headed up one of our 4 branches, now 5 branches of military services. And we had the pleasure of working together on the data governance documents. So we wrote the data governance policy for this military service. We wrote the data governance strategy and the implementation plan. And that was not a light lift, but we got to see what that process looks like when it's done well. So we were able to work alongside the chief data officer over an extended period of time. He called together a multidisciplinary team from his service to provide the content we needed to write all of those documents and the data we needed to write all those documents. both technical in nature and business process in nature. And we were able to really formulate all of those documents using this model. So this is one of many different data governance models that are available for use to anyone. And we heavily relied upon this approach. And the chief data officer assembled operators from this military service, such as those that were using the data to conduct cyber operations, intelligence sharing, and other things like that. And also as business partners. So the military services, general counsel, data architects, data engineers, data scientists, and chief information security officers to articulate the content that we needed to write all of these data governance policies and procedures, roles and responsibilities. So the lawyers really worked hand in hand with the service and all of these more than 50 stakeholders to create these governance documents, including the strategy and implementation plan. And I share that story with you to show that this is not necessarily something that is done overnight, and it's not necessarily something that is going to be a quick fix. But I argue that it really requires, trusted data really requires this kind of rigorous approach, this kind of formalized approach. And in my experience, this systems-based approach to data governance is really the precursor to a trusted, reliable, accessible data that we all need in this world that we're living in, whether it's law enforcement or on the prosecution side. So a systems-based approach to data management introduces this rigor, and it moves an organization from a siloed data environment more to a shared data environment where we can, with confidence, share data for intelligence purposes, for prosecutorial purposes, for fighting crime. These are some of these are not endorsed on my behalf, but these are just a selection of automated governance tools that I'm familiar with. I know there are others, but when we talk about data governance, we want to talk about a world that is carefully curated and automated. Because unless it's automated and tracked and managed, it's probably not going to be very effective. If you write a data governance policy, but you never put a budget behind it and you never automate it within your environment, it's going to be very difficult to get that trusted data for operational purposes. So this slide is just meant to illustrate some of those governance tools that are out there that I'm aware of. And finally, if you want to find out more about data governance, these are some of the resources available. Again, the DAMA model is what I showcased in these slides, but these are other resources for your perusal.
Super. Thank you very much, Catherine. This was very useful. I mean, I can confirm the reference you've made to the organized and crime threat assessment. Indeed, also from Europol's side, we see that almost any crime nowadays has an online component. This is also why our cybercrime center has to work with all the other centers at Europol, such as, for instance, the European Counterterrorism Center or the Serious and Organized Crime Center. This needs to be hand in hand. I also loved your K9 metaphor here, that which ultimately told us, well, not only the dogs, but also the data has to be carefully managed to be trusted, right? So all about quality, security, availability. This is what data governance really is about. And well, last but not least, that's also something we've seen here at Europol. I can confirm that if you look into your data governance model, you probably have to move from certain silos to a more centralized governance environment in order to tackle cybercrime and other forms of crime, which are becoming more and more complex. At the same time, and I think here this has become very clear also in your presentation, this has data protection implications. This has security implications. So we need to be very conscious of that in order to get the job right. With that, I would like to hand over to Brian J. Bennison. So he has a pretty different background. So basically, what Brian does is studying how universities are training students to deal with cybercrimes. So we go a little bit into the prevention side of things, but Brian is also involved in master's programs targeting professionals working in cybercrime, including law enforcement agencies. So Brian, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jan, and I promise I'll keep it brief so we can preserve some time for questions. As Jan pointed out, my background is a little bit different. The way I'd like to explain this is I'm training all of the people you guys are going to hire in the future to solve these problems, and I'd like to just speak briefly on how I think universities need to change their pedagogy to include cybersecurity and AI literacy. Uh, one of the challenges that I think is law in itself as an institution and legal education, certainly whether it is in Europe or in the United States, is a very traditional educational pedagogy, and it comes with some assumptions that really challenge. The modernization of the world, some assumptions in just how we deal with evidence is just that deceptive evidence is detectable, that we can figure it out, that determining jurisdiction, we can apply old principles of positive and negative comedy to see who would be really best suited to handle a particular crime. Vic bringing up that crime has, that sometimes it's difficult to tell what crime has been committed, whether it's a sex crime, a blackmail crime, or a cyber crime. Sometimes we might make that determination based on who might be best to have jurisdiction. But as we get into the new reality, we have issues not only authenticating what evidence is, we have issues with not everybody's going to have the same legal and cybersecurity infrastructure when it comes to these types of jurisdiction questions. And these are problems that students are going to have to reckon with. One book I just want to make a plug for, Robert Chesney's Cybersecurity Law, Policy, and Institutions, which I think is a great case book that kind of tackles how to provide some additional training on these problems. And I think he's got a great idea for how we can start incorporating cybersecurity law and policy training in education, whether you're doing an LLB program or a JD program, or however you're training people, just making sure that you're incorporating not only the legal principles, but also providing basic technical skills, ensuring that students have some exposure to synthetic media, that they're learning how to use AI-assisted research, which is still a controversial concept among law schools. UC Berkeley just came out really on the other side of this particular issue and came out strongly against using AI-assisted research in legal pedagogy. Mason Scalia certainly hasn't taken as hard a line, but it is definitely a controversial question among our faculty. And the truth is whether you like it or not, it's an important skill now to have as part of professional competency. More than just AI, just getting into different levels of compliance. Catherine made a plug for the OECD principles on interoperational governance. I'd like to make a plug for that as well. They've really, I think, developed a great framework for how people should think about including different technical skills in their training. And of course, most jurisdictions in the United States now also have professional rules of conduct that are specific to AI so that lawyers know how to use it as part of their daily operations. So how are law schools developing their training in order to incorporate these professions? And I want to be clear, I'm talking about more than just a law school talking about introducing an AI course. That's been happening a lot. You see it all the time. Universities across the world, they're launching an AI course, and it's the greatest thing you've ever heard of. Or in other cases like UC Berkeley, you might see schools saying, we need to keep AI completely out of our training. I don't think that either of those things represents the development of genuine cybersecurity and AI literacy skills. Technical literacy needs to be interwoven into the basic curriculum, and it needs to include cross-disciplinary communicative competence. It needs to think about the approaches to technology from an ecosystem based perspective, as opposed to just well, this is the crime and this is how we're going to deal with the crime. As we've determined now, jurisdiction is not going to be a clear-cut question to answer. The crime itself may not be a clear-cut question to answer. Data governance is really something that should be trained on from the very beginning of entry into the profession. And again, I'm going to finish with a plug for Chesney's book on cybersecurity law and policy, where he built a casebook that essentially helps students move through the process of analyzing cases that include AI, cybersecurity, and technology. And with that, I'm just going to conclude with the future of legal education. I genuinely think is interdisciplinary now. You have to have the technological skills to move forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Brian. And I couldn't agree more. In particular, in the area of data protection, I feel in our domain, you still see a lot of lawyers on the one hand, and then you see the techies on the other hand. But ultimately, in order to solve problems and address issues, I believe I concur. We need this. We need the professionals who are at least comfortable on both sides of the aisle. Let's say. So I'm grateful that you are taking on the job of training our future employees, as you have put it. So. When you talk about the old order versus the new reality, I imagine this is one of the most dynamic jobs, huh? Because, I mean, for other areas, I don't know, if you're studying art or something, probably you can develop a curriculum which may then be developed for a couple of years, in particular if it's historical art or something. In your domain, something which may work today or tomorrow doesn't necessarily work the week after, right? So, I mean, this is where I don't envy you for your job, because I'm sure it's a lot of effort to stay on top of things here. Also interesting, your elaborations that AI usage is still very controversial in many faculties. Yeah, I would concur with what I feel is your opinion. Well, it's there to stay. It's unavoidable. So I think we better deal with it for sure, also in the area of crime fighting. But once again, thank you very much for joining this panel here and providing a very interesting perspective. In the meantime, we also have the first questions from the audience. So Chris Velasco is in the room. So great to see you joining, Chris. Chris says, glad to follow this webinar and hear views from some well-known experts in this field. Question, can you provide concrete examples of law enforcement authorities in Europe making use of AI tools for their investigative work, specifically in cases dealing with cyber-enabled crimes and AI-assisted crimes, while highlighting the challenges? Before I open the floor to the speakers for whatever perspectives you may have, maybe just briefly at Europol, indeed, we are also using machine learning models in our crime analysis efforts. So that is what I can share with you here. Currently, we have 10 machine learning models, basically, which deal with different tasks and challenges, and maybe one operation which many of you may have come across, even though it's not specifically cyber-enabled, would be the investigations of EncroChat and later Sky ECC. So these were crime-related telecommunications providers, and then French and Dutch law enforcement being able, let's say, to seize the servers. So the communication could be analyzed. And here we were talking about huge amounts of messages. So in the case of EncroChat, those were 120 million messages. Later, Sky ECC, was 500 million messages. So these kind of analysis you cannot perform without using machine learning models. And when we are looking at challenges, of course, you have to set all of this up in a way which is compliant, including with data protection principles. So a lot of direct interaction with the EDPS was necessary, prior consultation was necessary. But I don't know if others here in the room have an answer or still complementary information for Chris regarding AI tools.
I can jump in, absolutely.
Please,
So,
yes.
I see AI and particularly machine learning and generative AI being used in two different environments, and I won't go into the specifics of particular European countries, but in my global perception of how these are being used, the one is absolutely, as you suggested, in terms of analyzing from a digital forensics perspective. So you've seized a huge amount of data. What is in here? And also, you know, the real advantages of that being to be able to make connections that humans have hitherto not been able to make because they weren't necessarily looking for them. So seeing patterns in the data that can be really, really helpful.
Yes.
The other is for illegal content. And this is a framework, a mechanism that we see particularly in relation to terrorist content, but most of all in relation to child sexual exploitation and abuse, where we have those partnerships between the big tech platforms who are using tools like photo DNA and AI-enabled classifiers of, say, inappropriate chat, potential grooming scenarios. They're detecting all of that material. They're reporting it via the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the US, which is then distributing that to law enforcement. And as you know, Europol is the hub for many of the EU and wider European countries in that regard. So it is about law enforcement using that, but it's also about law enforcement being the recipient of information that's been detected increasingly using AI-enabled tools. We have all sorts of considerations around the kind of the standard human in the loop question. There have certainly, I'm sure, been false positives. It's about how you train those tools to recognize what is suspicious, and those get stronger and stronger all the time. But it's also about detection via crawlers on the open web. So a lot of child helplines and hotlines using those kinds of tools. And then finally, I think increasingly we're seeing law enforcement and other safeguarding authorities using bots, whether that's as a first point of contact to someone who wants to report a crime or who wants help. But I think we can't rule out the possibility, and it's certainly my experience, that there is greater interest in also using those tools for automating undercover operations.
Yeah, could be. Thanks a lot, Vic. Also conscious of time, I would still like to invite all panelists, like if you have now listened to your peers and you came up with something that you really wanted to share or to comment upon, Philippe, Orhan, Catherine, Brian, now would be a good moment. Otherwise,
Maybe,
I'm also, yes, please. Yeah.
Maybe just, Jan, I think I don't want to add and elaborate what Professor Baines elaborated, but I shared on the chat a link to AI for Safer Children, where you have over 170 countries collaborating together. They use about 25 tools together to kind of go through content. I think Professor Baines mentioned that the content on child abuse is there, and they use AI to kind of process it. But very important note to note is that these tools are also helping the investigators to kind of reduce stress on them, because often when they go through all that content, lots of them kind of really have emotional impact, and basically they end up sometimes themselves being treated emotionally and for mental health. So I think the AI tools are helping to process things faster, but also helping the investigators to do their jobs better. So I think that's important to mention. I think I would like to thank all the colleagues here who shared information. I've learned a lot as well what you do. So I think there is potential collaboration with ITU, and reach out to Catherine, to Philippe, and Professor Baines. I think besides, having to share this information here, it's good also to connect and basically see how we can avoid duplication of efforts and benefit on the strengths of each other to kind of have wider reach. Because I know we are talking from European context, but without helping developing countries to move together with us, it's going to be very difficult for us to contain the issues we are facing as Europe or as West, because the global South needs a lot of help. And I think, I'm going to reach out to Catherine on DAMA, so whatever we can share with developing countries would be very important. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Orhan. So also for putting some emphasis on the, sometimes psychological challenges which law enforcement agents dealing with these matters have to go through. Unless there are other comments, I would probably like to close here, conscious of time, but fully subscribing to what Orhan has just said. Not only, I think, panelists amongst each other, but also if in the audience there are, let's say, additional questions. I believe all of us are traceable on LinkedIn as far as I've checked. There's also a LinkedIn group from EDEN, so Europol Data Protection Experts Network. So if you have joined this talk and you found it interesting or inspiring, please reach out to us and we will make you EDEN members. We will have an EDEN conference in Lisbon on 22nd, 23rd of September of this year, in which we are going to have a number of panels on topics such as this one. So if you like this exchange or this conversation, please join us in Lisbon. That would be an in-person conference. There's also a social event then at a very pretty venue. So Lisbon in September, there are worse places to be than this one. So if you can make it, would be a pleasure. Special thanks to Ilya Koloshenko, the man behind the scenes here who organized this EDEN webinar. And greetings to all of you out there. Let's keep in touch and continue this important debate. It was great having you, colleagues. Thank you very much for your time and your commitment. Have a great day.